Hello. This is Peter, who I have asked to come and have a chat with you today. We know him because he does a lot of stuff with CareFlight. He is does a lot of education with us, and he's been around helping us out for a long time, and I just know that he is very open about his mental health journey, and I've asked him here today to talk about that, and also just a bit of interest about what the Fireys are doing from their point of view. Shared experiences are very important, and I think it's super important that especially men have been willing to get up and talk about what's been going on in their lives. And even like in the last month, one of my friends went deep into the national park and killed himself with no indication to anyone around him that there was anything wrong with him. And so I just think it's super important that we get people like Pete to come and speak to us all and let us know there's no shame, and make it okay to tell everyone your story. And so here is Peter.
Thanks, Kirwan. So I'm a firey, worked for Fire and Rescue New South Wales back when it was the New South Wales Fire Brigades. I started in 1992. I was 18, never had a full-time job, like a permanent full-time job before that, so I was quite young when I joined. And if anyone's quick at maths, this year's my 29th year with now Fire and Rescue New South Wales. I also do a bit of work with CareFlight in teaching, help design scenarios and simulations for them. I have worked with the New South Wales Mental Health Commission. I was a presenter for the Black Dog Institute, and I currently sit on 2 committees with the State Insurance Regulatory Authority, which are the people that oversee the workers' comp system in their mental health reference groups. So I've been doing this stuff for a little while, probably whilst I was recovering from my breakdown, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is me. This is a drawing done by a gentleman by the name of Matthew Johnston, who works for the Black Dog Institute, or used to work for the Black Dog Institute. He was their artistic director. And Fire and Rescue was approached by the Black Dog Institute to participate in a clinical trial on, believe it or not, training middle management with mental health skills to see if it would reduce the impact on the staff below them, giving people just that little bit of training and making a positive difference. So it was a clinical trial. It was run by an associate professor over there, Sam, I can never think of his surname, but he worked with Fire and Rescue. They developed a training package for our middle managers, and then ran a control group and looked at fireys that have gone off with mental health issues and getting them back to work. And the control group was taking longer to get people back to work. So a little bit of training made a difference. But this was drawn as part of a video that was done, and I wrote my story whilst I was suffering from depression and anxiety. The black and white picture is from the proof that was sent to me. I was having a really, really bad day one day, and Matthew emailed this through to me so I could have a look and approve it for the next stage. And it made a huge impact on me. There were some minor changes, had to increase the number of children in one of the pictures and all that type of stuff, but essentially it was just fantastic based on my story. He also asked me if I wanted to put my name on it. So one of the lines in the video, and it's on YouTube, is firefighters are strong and tough and resilient, they don't break down. And I had. There's a social construct of what firefighters are. There's a social construct of what police officers are. There's a social construct of what doctors are and paramedics and nurses. And it's actually, in my opinion, really unhealthy to the people that work in those professions. Because when you turn the television on and you know, those emergency services, those physicians are the heroes and just have got it all together all the time, creates a bit of a false construct of what we are. At the end of the day, we're just ordinary people doing amazing things in sometimes some pretty austere environments. So it took me a long time. I ended up having a conversation with my family about putting my name on it. I spoke to Dr. Sam Bendel about putting my name on it. I showed her the video and a couple of other really trusted people. And in the end, I did it. And I'm incredibly proud that I have now. But how did I get from that to this. So this is me about 2.5 years later. I successfully won a Churchill Fellowship to travel around the world and study rapid motor vehicle rescue techniques. And this photo is taken in a place called Korfjord in Norway, which is well inside the Arctic Circle, where I went with the Norwegian Air Ambulance to have a look at what they were doing and how they were training. The journey wasn't easy. It certainly wasn't a straight line from point A to point B, but at the end of the day, I got out the other side, and that's the bit of my story I like sharing. But this is where it started. So I was responding to a motor vehicle collision, persons trapped, in the M2 tunnel on the M7 motorway. M2 motorway, sorry. We'd taken delivery of this fire truck the day before, 4 p.m. the day before, brand new fire truck turns up. I'd helped design this fire truck. I'd helped build this fire truck, and I was the only qualified driver that night shift. Cruising down Pennant Hills Road, the siren stopped working. So, second call, mechanical issues start occurring. It was 6 a.m. in the morning. The traffic pushed me onto the bus, into the breakdown lane. And the breakdown lane on the motorway was getting narrower and narrower. So I decided to move into the bus lane. I didn't see the bus coming. The bus just drove into the B pillar of the fire truck. They were going to cut me out of the fire truck. And I just thought, that is so uncool. So I managed to get myself out over the transmission tunnel and out the other side, and I was taken to hospital. When the ambulance turned up, we had some senior officers turn up along the way. One said, "How are you going?" And I said, "I've had better days." The ambulance said to me, "Where do you want to go?" I wasn't critically injured, and I was standing. And I just said, which is the hospital with the lowest wait times. So they took me off to Hornsby Hospital. Had some x-rays, no permanent damage, just some soft tissue injuries. I was interviewed by the police in hospital, and then I had to catch a cab back to the fire station. My wife couldn't come and get me, and no one from fire and rescue turned up at the hospital. From that point on, I had about a week off. I get bored at home if I can't do anything, so I went back to work. But I started living with chronic pain. So for those that aren't aware, chronic pain's a pretty good precursor to mental health issues. So at sort of early 30s, I didn't want to be on pain medication. In hindsight, probably not the best idea, but I certainly didn't want to spend the next 50 years on pain medication. So I didn't. I also started having issues at home started to become more pronounced. So probably a slightly dysfunctional marriage with the chronic pain, started to develop into depression, started isolating myself from my family. I wasn't violent, but I was certainly aggressive. I'd be watching TV in another room, my kids would come in, and I would get aggressive with them, even if it was just the ads they were interrupting. But at work, I was functioning normally, absolutely normally. But as the clouds started to roll in, I got worse and worse. And there was an incident that happened at work, and it's probably the one part of my story I don't talk about because it doesn't matter, if that makes sense. It doesn't matter what the causal factor is. It's about the recovery that's really, really important. But there was a critical incident that happened at work, and that's it. Probably not my finest moment, potentially career limiting, but it is what it is at the time. You really don't have control over what you say or what you do. I was at the office, texted two people. One was the Assistant Director of Health and Safety, and one was a really trusted friend. I was in that fight or flight mode. My heart was racing, I was shaking, I couldn't focus, I was crying. My mate messaged me first, said, "Are you okay?" And I went, "No, wasn't okay." So he got the other person to ring me. So he rang her, the Health and Safety Assistant Director, and she rang me. I spent 2 hours on the phone to her. She said, go home after this 2 hours. So I hung up from her, got in my car and drove out the gate. And I knew I couldn't drive. So I rang another mate that I really trusted. And I spent ages on the phone to him. And after about 40 minutes, I felt I could drive. So I drove the 40 minutes home, talking to him the whole way. And when I got home, I said, I'm good now. And I hung up. And there were 7 messages. And they were all from the Assistant Director of Health and Safety. The first one was, hey, just checking on you. Just give me a ring when you get this message. The last one, there was a fear in her voice I have never heard before, and I've never heard it since. She thought I'd killed myself, but I hadn't. So she gave me, it was a Wednesday, she gave me the Thursday off, and then I had to go back to work on the Friday in her office. And it was probably the best thing I ever did. And again, this is my journey. Everybody's journey is different, but my journey, for me, it was the best thing I could possibly do, was get back to work, not in my workplace. Eventually, the sun started to come up, the clouds blew away, and I moved on. I still get emotional talking about things. The 2 hardest conversations I ever had, one was with my psychologist, the very first appointment. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the second one was with my kids. And it's one of the things I always tell at the Care Flight when I talk to the doctors at Care Flight. I had to sit my kids down and explain to them I was a bad father. That when I was unreasonable, when I was aggressive, when I was abusive, don't fight with me. Just walk away. Go and see your mother. And it would be the hardest conversation I've ever had. My daughter would have been about 7 at the time and my son would have been 9. Luckily, no permanent damage to those relationships because of the honesty that began at that point. And now I have 2 amazing kids that really look after their friends and colleagues at work. But what did make the difference? Someone in the organisation cared about me. So it wasn't the first time I'd spoken to the Assistant Director of Health and Safety. Because of my back injury and my drive to do still cool stuff and become a rescue instructor with the organisation, there was some issues. So I got to know her prior to my breakdown. One of the things she said to me one day after a meeting was, what can I do to make things better for you? And my response was, at the moment, I don't know. But you've done something nobody else has done, and that's ask that question. So I felt like someone cared. I don't expect the Assistant Director of Health and Safety and Fire and Rescue to know everybody, but I think that return to work coordinators should know people. If they're responsible for a particular area, they should at least walk through every now and again and be noticed and seen and have a chat. I think the peer support team needs to be known by people. We have a peer support team, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but essentially the entire organisation's broken up and there are peers everywhere. We have over 100 peers in our organisation and you know who they are. So having that personal connection where someone I genuinely felt that they cared, made a huge impact on my recovery. The organisation helped me get help. Fire and Rescue has EAP, Fire and Rescue has chaplaincy, peer support, all that type of stuff. I'd done the EAP thing a couple of times. I never stuck with it. I'd never stuck with it for a whole range of reasons. One of the psychologists that I spoke to on the phone made me feel like it was my fault, that I was wrong. When I had my breakdown and I went in on that Friday, between the Fire Brigade's occupational physician and the Assistant Director of Health and Safety, they found me someone that they thought would work really, really well with me. And there's an amazing psychologist who's not there anymore, but was at a place called the Happiness Institute in the city. So that contact and the understanding of what I needed made a huge difference. It meant I didn't have to try and keep looking for psychologists that work with me. My first psychologist session ran a little over. So my first psychologist session was 40 minutes long. It was booked in as 40 minutes long. An hour and 40 minutes later, I walked out of that office. I was emotionally and physically drained. I'd spent almost the entire time in tears. I had gone through a huge range of emotions in that room, and I was just exhausted at the end of it. But I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel that I wasn't being heard. But it just ran over. It just went on and on and on. There was so much to get out. And I think not knowing the journey and having those times, having a timeline, I was fairly conscious of it as we got closer to it, and as there was no sensation of them about to stop my session, it was really, really, really helpful for me. It just allowed me to get out what I needed to get out. I was lucky I made one towards the end of the day. There was no one after me. I would have hated to have been the person in the waiting room if I was first in the morning. But in my case, I was really lucky. And I think if I was going to go through that again, I would ensure I told my psychologist that this is the first time. It's my first session or whatever it is, just so they know. My organisation made it easy to go to my appointments. So I was never questioned. I'd been moved into health and safety branch. I spent 10 months in there. I would just tell them I had a psychologist appointment, and I would make them to suit me. I would make it in the middle of the day. There was an office in the city and there was an office in Parramatta. If I was using the office in Parramatta, I'd make it at the end of the day and I would leave early. But they never challenged me. They never questioned me. But I also didn't abuse the system. So by making it easy, it removed some of the stigma. It became normal. We don't question people with a broken arm if they've got to go and have a follow-up session. So it was just easy. And that's really, really important, especially when you're dealing with the stigma that goes along with mental health in the type of work we do. My dealings with the insurer weren't adversarial. I've spoken to a whole pile of people since I had my breakdown, and I have been incredibly lucky that I had some really good people that I had to deal with along the way. So the insurer, the return to work coordinator, the return to work manager were all really, really good. But I also have colleagues. One watched another firefighter die, and he had private investigators sitting in a van out the front of his kid's school taking photos of him and saying, if you are well enough to pick your kids up from school, you could be driving a bus. 400 pages of photos were sent to him by the insurer because they thought he was making it up. He'd seen a colleague die and he was not okay. But there was this massive push to get him back to work. So I don't think that's helpful along your recovery journey. I got the opportunity to present to the federal government Senate inquiry into first responder mental health. One of the things I recommended to them was an ombudsman. Because at the end of the day, the employer has a vested interest in getting you back to work, and the insurance company has a vested interest in getting you back to work. And sometimes it feels like no one's on your side. And there's no one independent. So for me, I think that would make a huge difference in the recovery journey. Some people will try and take advantage of it. Most won't. Most want to get back to work. Most want to be doing something useful. Most want to try and get back to doing something rewarding. Sometimes it just seems from that insurance perspective that the position is that most don't. And that's just not true. I never felt rushed to get better. If you break your arm, simple fracture, 6 weeks, back at work. It's a bit harder with a mental health condition. So I was suffering from depression and anxiety. I would be just so depressed going home. And at night I'd lay in bed and I'd be thinking about what happened that day. And then I'd be worrying about what's going to happen the next day. And I'd be on the bus on the way in and I'd be worrying about what's happening that day and what's going to transpire, and would just catastrophize everything. I would stand in Hyde Park in uniform at lunchtime crying for some days, especially early on. A mental health recovery takes time. It's not something that can be rushed. Comments like, you'll be right, it's not helpful. Comments like, just get over it, not helpful. Are you okay? That's a helpful question. Is there anything I can do for you? Is a more helpful question. What do you need? Is a more helpful question. Trying to put time limits on getting people back to work is not helpful, because everybody's journey is different. Everybody's story is different. Their starting points are different. But my organisation, and it's probably because of where I was rather than the broader organisational culture, made it easy, and they made me feel safe, and they didn't rush me. And even when I left Health and Safety Branch and I moved back into the training directorate, there'd been a restructure, and there was a new director, and I was quite open and honest with her at the beginning about what I'd gone through, and she was fantastic. Took it seriously, supported me, ran interference where she needed to, but didn't rush me to be back to 100%. So what would I do differently, and what would I change on my recovery journey? I wasn't prepared for the journey I was embarking on. I had no idea. My understanding of a psychologist was what I've seen on television. It's not necessarily an accurate portrayal, probably like doctors aren't accurately portrayed on television, because firefighters aren't either. I was certainly not prepared to sit in the office of a psychiatrist. I was not prepared to have the conversations about being medicated by a psychiatrist. I was medicated for about 6 months because of the type of depression I had. It wasn't a chemical imbalance. So once they worked that out, they took me back off those drugs. But if I thought I had a stigma around mental health before I started my journey, I had a bigger stigma around the medications. And there's a whole pile of side effects that go along with medications. So I would do more research. I'd want to know more going into it. I would seek help earlier. And this sort of flows into the second one about persist with finding a good psychologist. I'd rung the EAP a couple of times and had 2 bad ones. But if I had have persisted, maybe I would have come out the other side a lot earlier. Maybe I wouldn't have ended up suffering from depression and anxiety. Maybe I wouldn't have had the negative impact on my kids that I did. I don't think that I would want to go through it again, but I'm glad I did. I think it's given me more empathy, and by being able to say I suffered from depression and anxiety, and that I went and saw a psychologist, and that I went and saw a psychiatrist, hopefully will make somebody else seek help earlier. I've presented to our recruits every recruit class up until about 12 months ago, and I would play the Black Dog video, and then I would tell my story, and I'm completely open and honest, and they can ask me anything they want. And occasionally I'd had instructors sit in the room just to see what's going on, and then they'd come to me afterwards and say, I've made an appointment with my GP to get a mental health plan. So the help seeking, early help seeking, is significantly important, hugely important in the journey and your recovery. I would work on my resilience. I hear the word resilience a lot, and I really don't know how to describe my personal resilience. Even now, I get frustrated, I get annoyed, I wonder why I'm there. Things that shouldn't bother me, especially at work. The reason I do so many things, whether it be the Sierra staff or the Care Flight staff, or I was selling camper trailers last week for a mate, is because that's my mental health time. Fire and rescue pay me a really good wage, but I don't necessarily believe as a workplace it's a healthy environment. And those other places give me joy and satisfaction and make me feel valued. So for me, that's part of my resilience, by not just being so focused on fire and rescue. In the old days, I would work my second job like all fireys do. So back in the days when we did 2 10-hour day shifts and 2 14-hour night shifts, I would do my 2 day shifts, next day get up, go to my second job, go to the fire station, go to my second job, go to the fire station, go to my second job, and then go home. And a lot of fireys do it. You know what? The one thing I've learned, money's not everything. The more you earn, the more you spend. It's normally just about 5% more than you actually earn. So I'm really conscious of taking more time for myself now. I am really conscious of doing things that completely remove me from the organisation and those stresses. In the next month, I'm driving to Kakadu, and there's a whole pile of time I don't even have mobile phone service. And that, to me, is what brings me back and centres me. And I've got a really positive relationship now, which is a huge, huge benefit. My fiancée can tell when I've had a bad day at work, and all she's got to do is put her arms around me, and that's it. I can feel the stress drain out of me. And if you had have asked me when I was married if it was ever like that, there's no way I would have said yes. But it's just amazing. And the other thing I'd do is I'd be more open about my mental health sooner. As hard as that is. Talking about standing in Hyde Park crying, getting upset when I talk about telling my kids I'm a bad father, talking about being medicated, talking about what it feels like to sit in the waiting room of a psychiatrist's office, I would be more open. And I have been since. But if I had have been more open earlier, maybe someone would have helped me. And I wasn't, at work, I was laughing and carrying on and just like always. But inside I wasn't. So being open about your mental health and having a good day or a bad day is really, really important. So what about fire and rescue? So this is their intranet page. This is the landing page when you open up the intranet. Mental fitness and resilience is top of the page. Our commissioner takes it seriously. The previous commissioner takes it seriously. So Mr. Baxter at the moment and Greg Mullins before that, both took it seriously. We've been running a peer support program for about 30 plus years now. We have 100 peers. We have 2 psychologists on staff, wellbeing manager, wellbeing coordinators, and then the usual EAP and all that type of stuff, and peer support network. I'd done all that stuff. I'd done the peer support talks. I'd done some of the other programs, the MindFit, all that type of stuff. I knew about mental health, but it ain't going to happen to me because I'm a firefighter, and firefighters are strong and tough and resilient. This is an organisational box ticking exercise. And it still happened. So I think the emphasis, so this is what it looks like when you get inside, that through that link. We have an awareness program, we have prevention programs, response, support, articles, videos, stories, literature. But you have to pick up on it. You have to click those buttons. And I don't know, even now, how to make people more willing to hit the button. I think it's just a broader organisational change or a broader cultural change that we're getting there, but it's not easy. When we get new people into the organisation, they come into places that are potentially not as helpful, for want of a positive word, in that space. I mean, we've got good stations and we've got bad stations. So I think that by having a multifaceted approach, it's the best way you're going to reach people. We have peer support officers. So, as I said, we've got about 100, bit over 100. We have a retired peer network as well. So if you're coming up to retirement or have retired, there is a peer support network for you. We have admin staff. We have engineering staff. We have property staff. So it's not just a uniformed thing. The peer support network's there for everyone. And when you click on a button, depending on where you are, it brings up photos, contact names, and all that type of stuff. If we have a critical incident, our comms operators will notify our duty officers. So we have a couple of duty officers on all the time, and they'll start assigning peers. They'll put people in planes, fly them all over the state, but they'll get them to jobs. At the Quakers Hill Nursing Home fire, for example, the nearest fire station, they put a couple of peers in there, and then they ran all the crews through that station. It's not necessarily helpful for everyone, and mandatory peer intervention is not a helpful strategy for everyone. It has to be people want it, and if they don't want it, you have to let it go. So there were a lot of resentful fireys, been on the fire ground all night. Almost 20 people had died, 80 people injured, and then they're told they can't go home because they have to go and sit with a peer and talk about their feelings. So evidence from around the world is now showing that that's not the way to do it, and hopefully we're starting to learn from that. So they can contact, a firey can contact a peer, or a peer will be directed to a crew based on turnout information. So it can go both ways. I'm peer trained. I don't appear on the peer list. Don't know why. I think they're a bit worried about me. But I've had more contact from people by just having conversations with them and letting them know that whatever they tell me isn't going to go any further than I ever had as a peer. So it's just creating that safe space to have that conversation. There's a whole pile of myth busting on the page as well, so people know. It's about trying to break down some of those myths that are circling around fire stations. It's about just breaking that stigma and the false reality of what mental health is and what mental illness is. So we talk about everything from getting a mental health plan to, and I'm actually, when I talk to the recruits, I actually say, if you don't want it to go through fire and rescue, go to your GP and get a mental health plan. Because it doesn't matter how they get help. It's about them getting help. It's about them being able to be fully functioning again. And these are some of the programs we offer. We offer Fit Mind, which is the 3-part video series that we have for recruits. Essentially is where it starts. It opens with the Commissioner talking about mental health. And then there's a whole pile of fireys that appears, and they talk about their own stories of jobs that have impacted them. One of them's a firefighter who has since left the organisation. A couple of them have retired. So some of it's not quite current, but it certainly puts it into the firefighter's perspective. And I think that's important. You need to be able to speak the same language. The RAW program is Resilience at Work. It's about mindfulness, but it's not necessarily tailored to firefighters. It's a bit more broad than that. Again, the meditation and all that, doesn't necessarily work for me. Does for some. I can't sit still that long. So there's the peer support network, as I said. There's the 100 peers. They go and do, all obviously unpaid like the peers here, and they go and do station presentations and try and get around to every station once a year. So that's 100 peers, about 400 permanent shifts, a bit more, maybe 500 permanent shifts, and about 250 retained stations. So you're looking at about 750 sessions a year they try and run. There's the well check program. So sometimes I'll bring a psychologist in and you can sit down with a psychologist and have a well check. But it doesn't really go anywhere from there. So I think that's a little bit of it can raise flags, but it doesn't necessarily help you deal with the problem, because then you have to go and find your own psychologist. So it's a bit, and you have to be prepared to have that well check first. So I think if you're prepared to have the well check, I think you're probably already prepared to go and speak to your GP. We have the chaplaincy, which does hatchings, matchings and dispatchings. Him and his wife. When I was married, I stopped at a motor vehicle accident on a day off. I was driving to a friend's place. It's a horrific accident. 2 people ended up dying. And the mother of the child that died was still fully conscious and relatively uninjured in the car. My wife at the time has never been exposed to that type of stuff, but she jumped out of the car as well. And she was having sleep issues because of the job. So I rang the chaplain and he turned up with his wife and we sat down and we had a cup of tea and talked garbage for half an hour, and then he said, well, so tell me about the job. So it's for our families, there's males, and like the husband and wife team makes it really good, and in regional areas we have associate chaplains, so they're salvos. And then we have the mental health toolkit, which is the brochures, the leaflets, the information and all that type of stuff. But what about training? For me, this is the most important part that gets missed every time. There's evidence that suggests that training people for the job they're going to undertake leads to better mental health outcomes in your staff. So there's a bit of stress inoculation in there. There's teaching those skills, making things automatic. But it costs money. And in our organisation, training's being eroded. I think partly because of units of competency, partly because the short-term benefits are not measurable. So to pension me out, say 10 years ago when I started looking into this, to pension me out with post-traumatic stress disorder as a senior firefighter would have cost the organisation alone $800,000. So that's an increased premiums, overtime, all that type of stuff. And then there's the insurance company's costs that go along with that as well. The problem is, by providing training, realistic, evidence-based, scenario-based training, the impact of that training isn't seen for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. Perhaps it's never seen. And when you can just tick a box and get people in one end and out the other end really quickly, you start to have issues. When the senior officer that's in charge of training isn't going to be in the position to have those cost savings, those long-term cost savings attributed to them, there's less drive to do it. The only thing we measure our senior managers on effectively is budget. Whereas if you look at the United States Navy, what they do is they measure on staff retention. So if you are a captain of a ship and you are turning staff over, that reflects on you. If your staff are not promoting, that reflects on you. Battle readiness, damage control, all reflect on the captain. It's not just budget. For me, that's where the space that we really, fire and rescue really does need to do the most work. We've got a whole pile of stuff being built at our new academy out at Orchard Hills. I don't necessarily think that it's going to be the panacea to the organisation and help solve those mental health deficits until they start resourcing the training and the instructors. The instructors at the college for about the last 5 years, we've been 20 staff short. People don't want the jobs. It's incredibly high stress, longer hours. We're competing 4 or 5 days a week as an instructor versus 83 days a year as a firey on a fire truck. So the work-life balance is different. But if we can get really good training, it makes the job fun for a start, but it also protects our staff, gives them the skills they need. There was an airline crash in Sioux City 30 odd years ago. The fireys within the previous 12 months had undertaken training there, and when they were interviewed, they were making reference to things like, we knew what we were supposed to do, we were confident in what we were supposed to do. You know, even though it was the most horrific scene any of them had or will ever see in their entire careers, they knew and they could stay on task and they could complete the mission that they were required to complete. And that's a huge, huge benefit to your mental health. So then there's this quote, which is supposed to be attributed to the United States SEALs. So under pressure, you don't rise to the occasion, you sink the level of your training. It's actually not that. It came out of a Greek philosopher and slightly different, but it kind of works. And I think that's really important. The more training, and it's the simple things. When I train recruits, I say, you need to know what's on your truck. You need to know what's in the kit. If you do the simple things well, you know what's there, you know where it is, everything else will flow on from that. But as soon as things start to go wrong, and it's normally the smallest things, the job will spiral out of control and you'll have a worse mental health outcome at the end of it. Whether they listen to that when they go to the station is a different thing. So I suppose my journey, I like this photo. This is one I took in outback Queensland, I think. The view wasn't always the greatest, the short-term view. But if you can look past the short term and down the longer term, it's quite a spectacular view. When I was suffering from depression and anxiety, I couldn't see past the donkey, to use the polite term. I couldn't see past that donkey, and no one could have forced me to look past the donkey either. I'm currently supporting an amazing woman who is suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the next level, I suppose. It is just, and her story of trauma is just horrific. And at the beginning, I couldn't make her see the long term, the bigger picture, the better looking scene. But she's getting there now, and I think I've learned a lot from being on one side of it and on the other side. Not that I was suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but from the depression and anxiety. And now I take time to take in the view. So this is on the Sturt Highway out heading up from South Australia into Northern Territory. I posted this to Facebook, and my daughter commented on my comment because I put with it, just trying to find a tree to have a wee behind. My journey hasn't been without issues. It hasn't been straight. It hasn't been simple. It hasn't been fun. It's been trying. It's been emotionally draining. It's been difficult, fatiguing. But we need to talk about it. We need to change the culture. We need to change the stigma. And not just within our services, but in the broader community. You know, people need to know that it's okay not to be okay. I always had an issue with Are You OK Day, in that, are you okay? And someone goes, no, but they didn't give you the next sentence. They do now. But I don't feel in the beginning the messaging was on point, and there was a little bit of a gap. If you are supporting someone on their mental health journey, you can't fix them. But you can walk beside them and let them know that you're there. And if you have to walk your own journey, your own mental health journey, find someone that you can lean on. It doesn't have to be your spouse. Mine wasn't, and I think for me that was really important that it wasn't, so I didn't unload onto her at the time. But find someone to walk with, because together it just makes it that little bit easier. Thank you.